They were told Americans would violate them, torture them, strip away every shred of dignity. But when 23-year-old Greta Hoffman backed against the bare-brick wall in Camp Shanks, New York, May 1945, and whispered, "Please don't," to the approaching GI, the enemy broke her, not with cruelty, but with a photograph. She expected violence. Instead, he showed her his daughter. For this terrified German signals operator, surrender meant discovering that monsters could have families too. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold accounts from World War II. These are the moments that history books often miss. The spring rain fell cold and relentless over the German port of Bremerhaven. May 1945, the war was over. But for the women standing in the muddy yard of a makeshift processing center, the worst was just beginning. Or so they believed. Greta Hoffman stood among them, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform soaked through, the gray-green fabric clinging to her thin frame. At 23, she had spent 3 years as a signals operator, sitting in underground bunkers, wearing heavy headphones, relaying messages she barely understood about troop movements and artillery coordinates. She had never fired a weapon. She had never seen combat up close, but the propaganda had been clear. To the Allies, she was just as guilty as any soldier. Around her, perhaps 60 other women waited in the rain. Some were nurses, their Red Cross armbands torn or missing. Others were clerks, radio operators, telephone switchboard workers. A few had been drivers or aircraft spotters. Most were young, under 30. All wore the same expression, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and resignation. They had been told again and again what happened to women captured by the Americans. The stories varied in their details, but the theme was always the same: humiliation, violence, degradation. The American guard stood nearby, rifles slung over their shoulders, smoking cigarettes, and watching with expressions that were impossible to read. Some looked bored, others looked uncomfortable, as if they weren't quite sure what to do with this particular cargo. None of them looked like the monsters from the propaganda posters, but Greta knew better than to trust appearances. She had seen enough propaganda herself to know that enemies were always portrayed as evil. Perhaps the Americans did the same. Perhaps these men were simply waiting for the right moment. The transport ship that carried them across the Atlantic was a converted Liberty ship, its cargo holds retrofitted with rows of narrow bunks. The smell hit Greta first as she was herded aboard. Salt water, diesel fuel, and something else. Coffee. Real coffee. The scent was so unexpected, so out of place that it made her dizzy. The crossing took 8 days. 8 days of rolling seas and cramped quarters. 8 days of listening to the ship's engines throb and the other women whisper in the darkness. Some prayed, others cried quietly. A few, like Greta, said nothing at all, conserving their energy for whatever lay ahead. The food was strange, not scarce. That would have been familiar, but abundant. Bread that wasn't sawdust. Soup that had actual vegetables floating in it. Meat that wasn't horse or rat. The first time Greta was handed a tray, she stared at it for a full minute, convinced it was a mistake or a trick. Why would captors feed their prisoners better than Germany had fed its own people in the final years of the war? Some women refused to eat, suspecting poison. Others ate carefully, taking small bites, waiting for the sickness to come. It never did. By the 3rd day, even the most suspicious were eating everything on their trays, though none would admit it openly. To accept this food felt like a betrayal, though of what exactly Greta couldn't say. At night, Greta lay in her bunk and listened to the ocean. She thought about her mother back in Stuttgart, if she was even still alive. The city had been bombed so many times. The last letter Greta had received was in February 3 months ago. Her mother had written about standing in line for 4 hours to get half a loaf of bread, about the neighbors who had disappeared in the night, about the Russian advance from the east and the fear that gripped everyone. And here Greta was eating American food while her mother starved. The guilt was almost unbearable. When the Statue of Liberty came into view, some of the women crowded to the portholes to see it. Greta stayed in her bunk. She didn't want to see the symbol of American freedom. She didn't want to acknowledge that while Germany lay in ruins, America stood untouched. It was too much, too painful. An older woman, A nurse named Helga came and sat beside her. Helga was maybe 40, with gray streaks in her dark hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. She had worked in a field hospital near the Eastern Front. She had held dying men in her arms, boys, really, bleeding out from wounds no bandage could fix. "You should look," Helga said quietly. "You should see what we were fighting against." Greta turned to face her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at it. Look at what they have. No bombs, no ruins, everything intact. And we." Helga's voice trailed off. "We were told we were fighting for survival, for the fatherland. But look what survived and what didn't." The words hung in the air. Dangerous words, treasonous words. But the war was over, and treason no longer had any meaning. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a bright May morning. The women were assembled on deck, blinking in the sunlight, and marched down the gangway in single file. Greta's legs trembled as she walked. Whether from fear or from 8 days at sea, she couldn't tell. American soldiers lined the pier, watching them pass. Some of the soldiers looked curious, others looked uncomfortable. One young private, who couldn't have been more than 19, looked at Greta with something like pity. She looked away quickly. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want anything from these people. They were loaded onto buses. Actual buses with seats, not the cramped trucks she had expected. Through the windows, Greta watched New York City pass by. Buildings reaching toward the sky completely intact. Cars on the streets. People walking around wearing clean clothes, looking well-fed, going about their lives as if there had never been a war. The contrast was stunning, devastating. In Germany, people picked through rubble for scraps. Here, people complained about rationing that seemed laughably generous by German standards. The buses drove for what felt like hours, heading north. Finally, they turned through a gate marked Camp Shanks and pulled to a stop in front of a cluster of wooden buildings. The women were ordered off the buses and lined up for processing. This was it. Greta thought this was where it would happen. Whatever the Americans had planned for them, it would start here. The processing station was a large wooden building that smelled of disinfectant and something else Greta couldn't identify. The women were directed inside in groups of 10. Greta's group included Helga, 2 younger women who worked as typists, and several others she didn't know well. A female American officer, a lieutenant with red hair pulled back in a severe bun, addressed them in broken but understandable German. "You will be documented. Your possessions will be catalogued. You will be cleaned and given new clothing. Follow instructions. Do not resist. It will go easier for you." Greta's heart pounded. Cleaned. That's what they always said in the stories before the worst happened. "We'll get you cleaned up first." She glanced at Helga, whose face had gone pale. They were taken to a room with a long table where female clerks sat with typewriters and forms. One by one, the women were called forward. When it was Greta's turn, she approached the table with her fists clenched at her sides. "Name?" the clerk asked in German. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and an efficient manner. Greta Hoffman. Age: 23. Occupation in the Wehrmacht. Signals operator, Notre Herren. The clerk typed this information onto her form. "Any medical conditions we should know about?" The question surprised Greta. "No allergies. I don't understand. Are you allergic to any medications? Penicillin, sulfa drugs?" Greta shook her head, bewildered. Why would they care about her allergies? The clerk made a note and looked up. "Personal possessions on the table, please." Greta emptied her pockets. A comb with half its teeth missing. A handkerchief her mother had embroidered. A photograph of her family taken before the war. Her parents, her younger brother Carl, who had died at Stalingrad. The clerk examined each item, wrote a description on a form, and placed them in a small canvas bag with a number written on it. "You'll get these back," the clerk said. "The number matches your prisoner number. Don't lose it." Greta stared at her. "You're giving them back?" "Of course. They're your property." The clerk handed her a small card with a number on it. "Next room, please." The next room was where the fear really set in. It was tiled with drains in the floor and shower heads along the walls. Steam rose from somewhere, and the smell of soap, real soap, filled the air. A female American medic stood waiting along with two German-speaking assistants. "Remove your uniforms," the medic said in German. "Place them in the bins. You'll be given new clothing after you shower." Greta's hands shook as she unbuttoned her uniform jacket. This was it. This was the moment. She glanced around at the other women, all of them frozen in fear. Helga was crying silently, tears running down her face as she slowly removed her nurse's uniform. But the medic just waited patiently, not threatening, not leering. When the women were undressed, she directed them to stand under the showers. "The water is hot. Use the soap. Wash your hair thoroughly. We need to check for lice. It's procedure for all new arrivals." The water came on, and Greta gasped. It was hot, actually hot. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a hot shower. The last 2 years had been cold water. If there was water at all. She stood there, letting the heat soak into her skin, washing away months of grime and fear and exhaustion. The soap was white and smooth and smelled faintly of lavender. Greta held it in her hands, this small miracle, and felt tears mixing with the shower water. She had expected brutality, violence, degradation. Instead, she got hot water and lavender soap. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. After the shower, they were given towels, thick, clean towels, and directed to another room where stacks of clothing waited. Not prison uniforms, but simple dresses and blouses, skirts, undergarments, all clean, all in various sizes. "Take what fits," the medic said. "If it doesn't fit, exchange it for a different size." Greta found a simple blue dress that fit reasonably well. It was worn, but clean, probably donated by some American family. She dressed slowly, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. This kindness couldn't be real. It had to be a setup, a way to lower their guard before the real punishment began. The mess hall was larger than any dining facility Greta had ever seen in Germany. Long tables with benches, windows that actually had glass, electric lights overhead, and the smell. The smell nearly knocked her over. Bread baking, meat cooking, vegetables, coffee, real coffee. The women were directed to form a line. At the front of the line, American soldiers in white aprons stood behind a serving counter, ladling food onto trays. Greta watched the woman ahead of her receive her meal. A piece of chicken, actual chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll with butter, a cup of coffee, a piece of pie. When Greta reached the counter, the soldier serving her was a large man with kind eyes and a southern accent she couldn't understand. He smiled at her, actually smiled, and gave her the same portions as everyone else, more food than Greta had seen on one plate in years. She carried her tray to a table and sat down next to Helga. Around them, the other women sat in stunned silence, staring at their food. "Is it poisoned?" one of the younger women whispered. "Don't be stupid," Helga said, though her voice shook. "If they wanted to poison us, they would have done it on the ship." Greta picked up her fork. Her hand trembled. She cut a small piece of chicken and put it in her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, herbs, the rich flavor of actual meat. She had to close her eyes. She had to breathe because if she didn't, she was going to cry right there in front of everyone around her. Other women were having the same reaction. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate frantically as if the food might disappear. One woman, 2 tables over, did break down, crying. Great heaving sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. An American guard approached the crying woman. Everyone tensed, waiting for the rebuke, the punishment. Instead, the guard, a young corporal with red hair, knelt beside her and said something in English. When she didn't respond, he tried in halting German. "Is okay. You eat. Is safe." The woman just sobbed harder. Greta looked down at her plate, at the chicken and potatoes and beans, at the pie, actual pie with real fruit filling. She thought about her mother standing in line for 4 hours to get moldy bread. She thought about the children in Stuttgart picking through bombed-out buildings looking for anything edible. And here she was, a prisoner, eating better than she had in 3 years. The guilt was crushing, but she ate anyway because her body demanded it. because her stomach overruled her conscience, and with every bite, the world she thought she understood crumbled a little more. After the meal, the women were escorted to their barracks. The buildings were simple wooden structures, but they were clean and had real beds with mattresses and blankets, not cots, not straw pallets, actual beds. Greta was assigned to Barrack C along with Helga and about 30 other women. Each woman got her own bed, her own blanket, a small footlocker for personal items. There was a stove in the center of the room for heat. Windows, with screens to keep out insects. It was better than the barracks she'd lived in while serving in the Wehrmacht. That evening, after they had been shown where the latrines were and given basic instructions about camp rules, Greta sat on her bed and tried to process everything that had happened. The hot shower, the soap, the food, the bed. None of it matched what she had been told to expect. She was reaching for her footlocker to put away the small bag of personal items they'd returned to her when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. Male footsteps. The room went silent. Every woman froze. A figure appeared in the doorway. An American GI, a sergeant by his stripes, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and a serious expression. He looked around the room, scanning the faces, and then his eyes landed on Greta. "You," he said in German, pointing at her. "Come with me." Greta's blood turned to ice. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading. All the kindness, all the food, the soap, the beds. It had all been a setup. A way to make them let down their guard. And now she stood on shaking legs. Around her, the other women watched with expressions of horror and pity. Helga reached out and grabbed her hand, squeezing it once before letting go. Greta followed the sergeant outside. The evening air was cool, and she could hear crickets chirping in the distance. The sergeant walked ahead of her, not looking back, heading toward a smaller building at the edge of the compound. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. It was a small office with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a single chair. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair. Greta sat. Her whole body trembled. The sergeant closed the door and stood between her and the exit. There was no escape. Nowhere to run. She pressed herself back in the chair, making herself as small as possible. The sergeant took a step toward her. "Please." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Please don't." The sergeant stopped. He tilted his head, studying her face, and she saw something in his expression shift. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He took a step back and reached into his shirt pocket. Greta closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "Open your eyes," he said, his voice gentler now. "Look." She opened them. He was holding something out to her. A photograph. She took it with shaking hands. It was a little girl, maybe 6 years, old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, standing next to a bicycle. She was wearing a white dress with flowers on it. "My daughter," the sergeant said in German. His accent was strange but understandable. "Sarah, she's 7 now. This was last year." Greta stared at the photograph, unable to process what was happening. The sergeant pulled over a crate and sat down across from her, keeping his distance. You thought I was going to hurt you?" Greta couldn't speak. She nodded. He sighed deeply and rubbed his face with both hands. "I know what you've been told about us. I know what your propaganda said. But I need you to understand something." He pointed at the photograph. "That little girl is why I'm here. So she can grow up in a world where this kind of war doesn't happen again. Not so I can." He paused, searching for words. "Not so I can become the monster you think I am." Greta's hands were still shaking. "Then, why am I here? Why did you bring me here?" "Because you're a signals operator. You speak some English according to your file. We need translators, women who can help us communicate with the other prisoners." And he paused. "And because you looked like you might understand, like you might be someone we could talk to." "Talk to?" "The other women are terrified. They think we're going to kill them or worse. We need someone to help us explain that we're not, that they're safe here, that the Geneva Convention means something to us." He leaned forward slightly. "Will you help us with that?" Greta looked down at the photograph in her hands. The little girl with the gap-toothed smile. Sarah, 7 years old, growing up safe in America while German children scavenged in ruins. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you being kind to us?" The sergeant stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening camp. "Because somebody has to stop the cycle. Somebody has to show that there's another way. You want to know the truth?" He turned back to face her. "Most of us didn't want this war. We didn't want to leave our families, our homes, but we did it because it was necessary. And now that it's over, we're not going to become what we fought against." He walked back and gently took the photograph from her hands. "You can go back to your barracks now. Think about what I said. If you want to help, let the guards know tomorrow. If you don't, that's fine too. But either way, you're safe here. I give you my word." Greta stood on wobbly legs and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at him. "Why show me the photograph?" He smiled sadly. "So you'd see me as a person, a father, not a monster. Because that's what you are to me, too. A person, not a monster." Greta walked back to the barracks in a daze. When she entered, all the women surrounded her immediately, asking if she was okay, what had happened. She sat down on her bed and told them everything. About the photograph, about the daughter, about the request for help. Some didn't believe her. Some thought it was a trick. But Helga sat beside her and took her hand. "Maybe," the older woman said quietly, "maybe we were wrong about them. Maybe we were wrong about a lot of things." Greta decided to help. The next morning, she reported to the sergeant, his name was James Walker, and began her new role as a translator and liaison. Her days fell into a rhythm that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Wake up was at 6:30, not with harsh bells or shouting, but with a gentle knock on the barrack door from the guard on duty. The women had 15 minutes to dress and make their beds before breakfast. The beds had to be made neatly, but no one measured the corners with rulers or punished slight imperfections. It was order, but not cruelty. Breakfast was served at 7 due. More food than Greta could finish. Oatmeal or eggs, toast with real butter, coffee, sometimes fruit. The American guards who served the food were always polite, often friendly. One corporal named Danny learned to say good morning in German, and greeted each woman with a smile and those 2 words every day. After breakfast, work assignments began. The women were divided into groups. Some worked in the camp laundry, washing linens and uniforms. Others helped in the kitchens, peeling potatoes, and preparing vegetables. Some did mending and repairs. Greta's work was different. She spent her mornings helping translate camp announcements, medical instructions, and questions from new arrivals, who were still too frightened to speak. The work was light, laughably light, compared to what they'd done during the war. And they were paid for it. Not much, just a few cents per day. But it was real money that could be used in the camp canteen. The canteen sold small luxuries, chocolate bars, cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper. The first time Greta bought a chocolate bar with her own earned money, she stared at it for 5 minutes before unwrapping it. Chocolate, real chocolate, available for purchase. Like it was nothing. Lunch was at noon, dinner at 6 cows. Both meals were substantial. The women began to gain weight, their hollow cheeks filling out, their skin regaining color. Greta watched it happen to herself in the small mirror in the latrine. She looked healthy, well-fed, almost like she had before the war. It felt wrong. Evenings were free time. The women could read books from the small camp library, write letters home, or simply talk. Once a week there was a movie shown in the Recrec Hall, American films with subtitles. The first time Greta saw one, she was mesmerized. The colors, the sound, the sheer abundance displayed on screen. She left feeling dizzy and disoriented, unsure what was real anymore. Lights Out was at 10 sorry, strict but reasonable. And every night as Greta lay in her bed under her clean blanket, she struggled with the same impossible question. How could the enemy be treating her better than her own country had? The letters from home made everything worse. Or better. Or both. Greta couldn't decide. In late June, she received her first letter from her mother. The envelope was battered and had taken 6 weeks to arrive, routed through the Red Cross. Greta's hands shook as she opened it. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, the words difficult to read. She wrote about the occupation, about the Russian and American zones, about the hunger that persisted even though the war was over, about neighbors who had disappeared, some to prisoner camps, some just gone, about the struggle to find food, clean water, shelter in a city that was 70% destroyed. And then at the end, I hope you are safe, my darling girl. I hope wherever you are not suffering too much. I pray for you every night. Greta sat on her bed in the clean barracks, having just finished a dinner of roast beef and potatoes, and wept. Her mother was starving, truly starving, and Greta was here, safe and fed and warm, feeling guilty for every bite of food she ate. She wrote back, immediately, though she knew the letter would be censored. She kept it simple. I am safe. I am in an American prisoner camp. They treat us well. I am not hurt. I think of you every day. I love you. What she didn't write, I eat 3 meals a day. I have chocolate sometimes. I have soap and hot water. I am healthier now than I was while serving the fatherland. The contrast would be too cruel. The other women received similar letters. Stories of devastation, hunger, occupation, families torn apart. And here they were in what amounted to a comfortable boarding house compared to the hell their families endured. The guilt was a physical weight they all carried. But there were observations, too, that couldn't be ignored. Greta worked with the American guards every day now. She saw how they lived, their casualness, their informality with each other, the way privates could joke with sergeants, the way officers didn't demand absolute subservience. It was so different from the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. She saw them receive their own letters from home and get emotional. She saw them show photos of their children, their wives, their parents. She heard them complain about the food, which made her want to laugh and cry at the same time because even their complaints were about food that would have been a feast in Germany. And she noticed something else. They wasted things. Food left on plates, thrown away. Soap used once and discarded. Paper crumpled up and tossed in the trash. The abundance was so complete, so taken for granted that waste was inevitable. It was staggering, obscene, and yet that's what peace looked like, apparently. A place where you could afford to waste things because there was always more. It was the small moments that truly undid Greta's certainties. Not the big gestures, but the small human interactions that accumulated over weeks and months. There was the time a young private named Tommy taught her to play poker. He was 19, from somewhere called Iowa, and had absolutely no poker face. He lost every hand and laughed about it, showing Greta his cards and explaining where he'd gone wrong. "You're too smart for me," he said in English. And even though Greta's English was limited, she understood enough to smile. There was the rainy afternoon when Sergeant Walker brought his portable radio to the translator's office and let Greta listen to American music. Big band sounds, jazz, singers with voices like honey. He saw her foot tapping and smiled. "You like it?" She nodded, unable to explain that music had been absent from her life for so long that hearing it felt like remembering what it meant to be human. There was the day Corporal Dan's wife had a baby back in America. He received the telegram during breakfast shift and shouted with joy, hugging the other guards, showing everyone the message, "A boy, I have a son." He was crying and laughing at the same time. He showed the telegram to Greta, and she translated it for the German women nearby. They all congratulated him. This enemy soldier celebrating new life in the midst of all the death they'd known. And there was the evening in late July when Greta was walking back to her barracks and heard someone crying behind one of the buildings. She found a young guard. She didn't know his name, sitting on the ground, his head in his hands, sobbing. She should have kept walking. It wasn't her business, but she stopped. "Are you okay?" she asked in English. He looked up, startled. His face was young, maybe 21, and stray with tears. "I'm sorry, you shouldn't see." He trailed off. "What is wrong?" Greta's English was broken, but sincere. He wiped his face with his sleeve. "Got a letter from home. My brother. He didn't make it. Killed in the Pacific. Last week of the war. Last goddamn week." Greta stood there not knowing what to say. She thought of her own brother, Karl, dead at Stalingrad. She sat down on the ground next to this American soldier, this enemy, and they sat in silence together, two people who had lost brothers to the same stupid, senseless war. After a while, he spoke. "I don't hate you. You know that. I know I'm supposed to. You're German, but I just can't anymore. I'm tired of hating." "I understand," Greta said, and she did. By August, Greta felt like she was living in two worlds simultaneously. There was the world of her memories, of Germany, of the war, of everything she'd been taught and believed. And there was the world of Camp Shanks, of kind guards and hot meals, and a photograph of a little girl named Sarah. The two worlds couldn't coexist. One had to be false. But which one? Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Greta would replay the propaganda films she'd been shown during her Wehrmacht training. Americans were savage, barbaric. They would rape German women, torture prisoners, destroy everything. The films had shown atrocities, bodies, destruction. It had all seemed so real, so convincing. But where was the savagery? Where was the barbarism? She'd been here for 3 months now. 3 months of decent treatment. 3 months of guards who showed her photos of their children and taught her card games and cried about their dead brothers. Had it all been lies? All of it. If they'd lied about this, what else had they lied about? One evening, Greta sat with Helga in the barracks after dinner. Most of the other women were outside enjoying the summer weather. But these two preferred the quiet of the empty room. "I don't know who I am anymore," Greta confessed. "Everything I thought I knew. It's all wrong." Helga, who had seen more of the war than most, nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. I spent 3 years in field hospitals. I saw what our side did. I saw what their side did. And I'll tell you something. Suffering looks the same in any language. A dying boy calling for his mother. It doesn't matter if he's speaking German or English or Russian. The pain is the same. But we were told. We were told a lot of things," Helga interrupted. "Most of them designed to make us hate, because it's easier to fight if you hate. It's easier to sacrifice if you believe the enemy is evil." She paused. "But Greta, look around. Does this look like evil to you?" Greta couldn't answer. The transformation wasn't uniform. The 60 women in the camp responded differently to their captivity. Some, like Greta and Helga, began to question everything they had been taught. They engaged with the guards, learned English words, asked questions about America. They read the newspapers the guards sometimes left behind, struggling through English articles about the occupation of Germany, the Nuremberg trials, the full horror of the concentration camps being revealed. That last part was the hardest. The newsreel shown in the rec hall footage from Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the gas chambers. Some of the German women refused to watch. Some watched and claimed it was Allied propaganda, fake news designed to make them feel guilty. But others like Greta watched and felt something inside them break because it explained so much. It explained why the guards sometimes looked at them with such complicated expressions. Pity mixed with anger, kindness mixed with contempt. How do you treat with compassion people who served? However, indirectly a regime that did these things. There were arguments in the barracks, heated, whispered debates after lights out. Some women clung to their old beliefs desperately, needing them to be true because if they weren't, then everything they'd sacrificed had been for nothing. Other women wanted to forget entirely, to pretend none of it had happened. And then there were women like Greta who couldn't forget and couldn't pretend, who were forced to sit with the uncomfortable truth that they'd been on the wrong side. One night, a woman named Margaret, who had been a telephone operator, asked the question they were all thinking. If we were wrong about them being monsters, What does that make us? No one had an answer. In early September, Greta was sitting in the translator's office with Sergeant Walker, working through a stack of forms when he received a package from home. He opened it with obvious delight. Cookies, his wife, had baked some photos. A letter. He read the letter smiling, and then held up one of the photos. Sarah's first day of school, he said, showing it to Greta. The little girl from the first photograph, now in a school dress, holding a lunchbox, grinning at the camera. She is beautiful, Greta said sincerely. Walker looked at the photo for a long moment. You know what the hardest part of this war was for me? Not the fighting, not the fear. It was knowing that I was missing her childhood, that while I was over here, she was growing up without me. He looked up at Greta. And you know what really gets me? German fathers felt the same thing, missing their kids, worrying about them. We all wanted the same things, to keep our families safe, to go home, but somehow we ended up shooting at each other. Greta felt tears prickling her eyes. My brother Carl had a little girl. She was 2 when he went to the Eastern Front. He never came back. She's 5 now. She doesn't remember him. Walker was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You didn't kill him, Greta said. The war killed him. The war killed millions of brothers and fathers and sons. She paused on both sides. Yeah. Walker tucked the photo carefully back into his pocket. That's the thing they don't tell you about war. The enemy has families too. They love their children too. They're human too. If you really understood that, really felt it, you probably couldn't fight. So they train you not to think about it. They train you to hate. Is that why you showed me Sarah's picture? Greta asked that first night. To make me see you as human. Partly, but also because I needed to remind myself that you're human too. That every person in this camp is someone's daughter, someone's sister. That treating you with dignity isn't weakness. It's the whole point. If we can't do that, then what the hell did we win? Greta understood. The kindness wasn't just mercy. It was a statement, a declaration that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. That you could defeat an enemy without becoming evil yourself. It was the most dangerous weapon of all because it couldn't be defended against. Cruelty could be endured. Hatred could be returned. But kindness, dignity, those things slipped past all defenses and forced you to see the uncomfortable truth that you'd been wrong. The turning point came in late October. Greta received another letter from her mother. This one more hopeful. The Americans occupying Stuttgart were providing food aid. Soup kitchens had been set up. Children were being fed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her mother wrote, "The Americans here are not what we were told. They bring food. They help clean the rubble. Yesterday a soldier gave chocolate to the children on our street. Real chocolate." The children cried. Greta sat on her bed holding the letter, and something inside her finally fully broke. The Americans were feeding her mother, feeding German children, while she, a German prisoner, was also being fed. The same kindness extended to both defeated enemies and suffering civilians. She went to find Helga and found her in the common room listening to the radio, an American station playing music. Greta sat down beside her. "We were wrong," Greta said simply. "About everything," Helga nodded. "I know. What do we do now? How do we live with it?" "We remember," Helga said quietly. "We remember what real evil looks like and what real decency looks like, and we make sure we never forget the difference." That night, Greta looked at herself in the small mirror in the latrine. Her face had filled out. Her hair was healthy. Her skin had color. She looked better than she had in 5 years. Fed by the enemy, treated with dignity by the people she'd been taught to hate. She thought about that first night, backing away from Sergeant Walker, whispering, "Please don't." She had expected violence. She had received a photograph. She had expected degradation. She had received the chance to rebuild her understanding of the world. The hardest thing to accept was that her own leaders had failed her more completely than her enemies ever had. That was the revelation that would stay with her forever. Not that Americans could be kind. That was surprising, but comprehensible. But that her own country had lied to her, sacrificed her, and left her to starve while telling her it was for her own good. That was the wound that would never fully heal. In early December, the announcement came. The women would be repatriated, sent back to Germany. The war had been over for 7 months. It was time to go home. Greta should have been overjoyed. She should have been counting the days. Instead, she felt a creeping dread. Home meant ruins. Home meant hunger. Home meant facing what Germany had become. And there was something else. A fear she barely wanted to acknowledge. Would her mother, her friends, her neighbors, would they understand what had happened to her here? Or would they see her health, her well-fed appearance, and feel betrayed? Would they accuse her of living well while they suffered? The women talked about it endlessly in those final weeks. Some were desperate to return, willing to face anything to be with their families again. Others were terrified. A few even asked if they could stay in America, though the answer was always no. The day before departure, Sergeant Walker called Greta to his office one last time. She went without fear now. That seemed like a lifetime ago, that terrified girl backing against the wall. "I wanted to give you something," he said, handing her a package. Inside was a thick wool coat, American-made, and several bars of chocolate. "For your mother, and for you." Greta's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say. Just remember that this is what we wanted to build after the war. A world where enemies don't have to stay enemies. Where people can choose something different." He pulled out his wallet and showed her a newer photo of Sarah. "She's 8 now, and because of people like you, people willing to see beyond the propaganda, she might grow up in a more peaceful world." "Thank you," Greta whispered, "for everything, for showing me, for helping me see. Take care of yourself, Greta Hoffman, and take care of your mother. Help rebuild Germany into something better than what it was." The journey back to Germany was long and cold. The women sailed on another transport ship, this time heading east across a winter Atlantic. When they finally reached Bremerhaven, Greta stepped off the ship into a journey that was almost unrecognizable. The destruction was worse than she'd imagined, worse than letters could convey. Entire cities were rubble. People moved like ghosts through the ruins, and the hunger was everywhere, in every hollow face, every thin child. Greta made her way to Stuttgart with Helga and several other women. The journey took 3 days on crowded trains and broken roads. When she finally reached her mother's street, or what was left of it, she almost didn't recognize it. The building where she'd grown up was a shell, one wall missing entirely. But her mother was alive, living in the cellar with 2 other families. When Greta walked down those stairs and her mother saw her, the old woman's face crumpled. They held each other and cried, both of them shaking, both of them changed by the war in ways that could never be fully explained. That night, sharing the chocolate and wearing the warm coat, Greta told her mother some of what had happened. Not everything, not the full complexity of her transformation, but enough. Enough for her mother to understand that the Americans had been kind. "Good," her mother said, her voice. "Good. I'm glad someone was kind to you, my girl. I'm glad someone showed you mercy." Greta Hoffman lived for another 60 years. She married, had children, rebuilt her life in a new Germany. She never spoke much about the war to most people. It was too complicated, too painful, too full of contradictions. But to her daughter years later, she told the full story about being a signals operator, about the surrender, about the fear during the crossing to America, and about that night when she backed against the wall, terrified, and whispered, "Please don't," to a man she thought was a monster. He showed me a photograph of his daughter. She told her own daughter. Such a simple thing, but it changed everything. It made me see him as a person, a father, someone who loved his child the way I would someday love you. "Were you grateful?" her daughter asked. "Yes, but it was more than that. I was angry too. Angry that I'd been lied to. Angry that we'd been taught to hate people who were just people. Angry that so many had died because of those lies. She paused. The hardest thing to carry home wasn't the memory of fear. It was the memory of kindness. Because kindness demanded I acknowledge how wrong we'd been. And that's a heavy weight to bear. She kept the photograph of Sarah that Sergeant Walker had given her as they said goodbye. Kept it in a box with her other precious things. Years later, she wondered what had become of that little girl. If she had grown up happy, if she knew that her face had helped transform an enemy into a human being. And so, the photograph became more than just a picture of a child. It became proof that even in the darkest times, even between the bitterest enemies, humanity could survive. That a father's love for his daughter could bridge the gap between nations at war. That kindness could be more powerful than hatred. For Greta Hoffmann and the 60 German women who passed through Camp Shanks in 1945, the smell of lavender soap and the taste of real coffee became symbols of something larger than captivity or surrender. They became symbols of the possibility of redemption, the possibility that even people who had served the wrong side could be treated with dignity, the possibility that enemies didn't have to stay enemies forever. As Greta told her grandson many decades later, the Americans didn't defeat us with cruelty, they defeated us with humanity. And that was far more effective than any weapon because you can't fight against someone who refuses to become the monster you were told they were. And that is the story worth remembering. A story of how a terrified young woman expected violence and received compassion. How propaganda crumbled in the face of simple human decency. How a photograph of a gap-toothed little girl named Sarah helped end a war inside one person's heart. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold accounts from World War II. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today about the power of choosing humanity over hatred, even in our darkest moments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world that often teaches us to fear the other, to hate the enemy, sometimes we need reminders that kindness is the strongest,